What happens when a child becomes the source of the danger you never expected, the danger you never believed could come from your own home? What if the person you raised, protected, and loved was quietly planning your final moments while you slept just steps away? And what does it take for a courtroom to look at a 16-year-old girl and decide that she should never breathe free air again? These questions set the tone for this story, because the title, 16-Year-Old Gets Life Sentence Without Parole for Killing Father, isn't exaggeration, shock value, or dramatic framing. It is the exact reality of what a Montana courtroom decided after one of the most disturbing, meticulously planned patricides investigators had ever seen. And the thumbnail text, "She didn't expect a life sentence," captures the moment this teenager, who believed she had prepared for every outcome, finally realized she had miscalculated the one thing she couldn't control. Justice on Christmas morning, in what should have been a day of warmth, family, and quiet celebration, a father was found dead in his bed, shot multiple times with his own hunting rifle. The alleged story of a home invasion, told through shaking breaths by his teenage daughter, initially drew sympathy and horror. A terrified child, a murdered parent, a crime scene that seemed to point outward. But as investigators began pulling at small, uncomfortable threads inside that home, the story rapidly shifted from tragedy to something far more chilling, because nothing about the scene quite matched. Nothing behaved the way real home invasions do, and the young girl who cried through a 911 call was quietly hiding something darker than anyone expected. This case would unravel not with dramatic confessions or eyewitness sightings, but through small digital moments, light switches flickering at the wrong time, Wi-Fi signals connecting when she claimed to be asleep, and a neighbor's doorbell camera that unknowingly captured the truth. And before long, the world would see why a teenager ended up receiving the harshest sentence the justice system could deliver. But to understand why the court believed she deserved life without parole, we must go back to the moment everything began, Christmas morning, when a father's final breaths were taken by someone he trusted most. Christmas morning in Billings, Montana, should have been silent, gentle, and wrapped in the comforting rituals of family tradition. Snow layered the small homes on the west side of the city, holiday lights still glowing from the night before, giving the neighborhood a soft, warm stillness. Inside one of those homes, however, lay a scene so violent and so utterly out of place that even veteran officers struggled to reconcile the contrast. William Anderson, a 42-year-old science teacher known for his kindness and dedication, was found dead in his bed, 3 bullet wounds in his chest, blood soaking into the sheets that were supposed to carry him into a peaceful Christmas morning. The house itself felt frozen in the middle of a story that had paused too abruptly. Presents still neatly wrapped under the tree, Christmas cookies cooling on the counter, a movie paused on the TV from the night before. Nothing inside suggested chaos or panic, except the bedroom where William lay. And the only person who had been inside that home during the early hours of Christmas was his 16-year-old daughter, Emma. Her voice, trembling yet controlled, had been the first sign that something was wrong. "Someone broke in, my dad. He's not moving," she told the 911 operator. Officers arriving at the scene found Emma sitting on the living room couch, wrapped in a shock blanket, staring into nothing and repeating that she had been too terrified to come out of her room until she was sure the intruder had gone. At first glance, everything supported her story: a forced open window, missing valuables, and a frightened teenager whose tears looked heartbreakingly real. But beneath the surface, the crime scene whispered a different truth. Officers noted the window wasn't broken the way real break-ins usually are. Valuables were missing, but electronics remained untouched, and the home bore no signs of a panicked intruder searching for loot. Something felt staged. Something felt too neat, too clean, too rehearsed. And investigators would soon discover that while the house was quiet, one thing inside it had been wide awake during the hours before the killing, a small digital witness that caught what human eyes couldn't see. When the 911 call came in at 6:27 a.m., the dispatcher heard exactly what anyone would expect from a terrified teenage girl on Christmas morning: a trembling voice, sharp breaths, and words stumbling over each other, as she claimed an intruder had broken into the house and murdered her father. Emma Anderson told the operator she had been asleep when sudden gunshots jolted her awake. She said she froze, too scared to move, too afraid to look, too paralyzed to do anything but hide in her bedroom until the house fell silent again. Her voice cracked in all the right places, her pauses sounded natural, and her fear seemed real enough that the dispatcher flagged it as a priority response. When officers arrived, they found Emma exactly how she had described herself, wrapped in a blanket, shaking, eyes red and vacant, insisting she had only stepped out of her room after the gunfire stopped. On the surface, her story made sense. A teenage girl confronted with violence would hide. A single father would be vulnerable in his bed. A forced window and missing wallet pointed to a break-in gone wrong. But detectives have learned that the most convincing stories often hide the darkest truths. And something about this call bothered the responding officers, not because of what Emma said, but because of what she didn't say. Most victims ask if their loved one is alive. Emma didn't. Most children in shock ask if the intruder is still there. Emma didn't. Instead, she kept repeating the same details word for word, as if reading them from inside her mind. As detectives listened to the replay of her 911 call later, they noticed her breathing never truly spiraled into panic. Her voice never hit the uncontrollable peaks of someone experiencing fresh terror. And the most subtle sign of all, she never once asked the dispatcher to hurry. Her father was bleeding out in the next room, yet urgency was strangely absent. Something inside that call didn't fit the emotional reality of the scene officers found. But it wouldn't be Emma's voice that destroyed her story. It would be the silent details inside the crime scene that contradicted every word she said. The moment investigators stepped deeper into the Anderson home, the story Emma told over the 911 call began to peel apart, layer by layer. On the surface, everything looked like a textbook home invasion. A window in the living room appeared to have been pried open, a few valuables were missing, and a frightened teenager claimed she had hidden in terror. But real break-ins leave behind a certain signature: panic, speed, chaos, and this scene felt unnervingly tidy, almost arranged. The forced window had pry marks that were too clean, too symmetrical, as if someone had imitated what a break-in should look like rather than actually breaking in. The missing items were strangely selective. A wallet, a watch, but expensive electronics sat untouched in plain view. In true home invasions, burglars grab fast and messy, sweeping up anything of value. Here, items seemed chosen for symbolism, not theft. Inside William's bedroom, the story grew even stranger. For a man supposedly shot by a surprised intruder, the room showed signs of a controlled attack, not a chaotic struggle. A nightstand knocked over, but nothing else disturbed. A shattered lamp, but its pieces neatly clustered. 3 shell casings rested on the floor within a tight radius, not scattered the way they should be if a panicked shooter fired wildly. And then there was the bed itself, sheets soaked in blood, but no signs of rummaging, grabbing, or hurried movement. The killer had stood in one spot and fired with precision. No rushing, no fear, no hurry to escape. When detectives observed the break-in, they felt something they rarely admit: discomfort. Because instead of looking like a crime of opportunity, it looked like a scene built from the outside inward, engineered, not experienced. Every detail said invasion, but every pattern whispered staged. And still, Emma sat in the living room, wrapped tightly in her blanket, insisting she had heard footsteps, gunshots, and silence. But the house, its walls, its objects, its evidence told a different story, a colder one, a planned one. And soon investigators would realize that the answers they needed weren't in the bedroom or the window. They were hidden in Emma's behavior, which suddenly didn't look like trauma at all. At first glance, Emma Anderson looked like any traumatized 16-year-old who had just found her father murdered, shoulders trembling, eyes unfocused, hands wrapped tightly around a shock blanket as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. But detectives who had worked hundreds of crime scenes knew what genuine trauma looked like, and they also knew what carefully controlled behavior looked like. Emma's reactions didn't match the rhythm of someone truly shattered. Her tears came in bursts, almost on cue, then stopped abruptly the moment officers shifted their questions. Her breathing changed only when she spoke, not when she listened. And most unsettling of all, she maintained this odd awareness of her surroundings, glancing at officers as if measuring their reactions, not processing her own emotions. When asked simple questions, she answered too smoothly, her phrasing oddly polished for a teenager supposedly in shock. She repeated the same lines multiple times, with almost identical wording, as if rehearsed. Even her posture felt performed. A slight hunch, a soft voice, a trembling lip. Detectives had seen these patterns before in suspects who tried to imitate grief rather than feel it. But the real red flag came when officers gently asked about her father. Most children break the moment they say their loved one's name. Emma didn't. Her expression tightened for a second, then returned to its blank stare, as if she were describing an unfortunate event, not the violent death of the man who raised her alone for 5 years. She didn't ask if he might still be alive. She didn't ask what had happened to him. She didn't ask if she could see him. Instead, she asked only whether she would need to stay at the station long and whether she could charge her phone. Detectives exchanged looks, not in accusation but in curiosity. Who exactly was this girl, and why did her grief feel scripted? Something was wrong. Something wasn't connecting. This wasn't trauma, it was control. And the first undeniable crack in Emma's story would arrive not from her behavior, but from a weapon buried beneath the snow, carrying a truth she could never explain away. Behind the Anderson home, beyond the back porch and the untouched Christmas decorations, the snow hid something far more sinister than holiday footprints. As officers expanded their search radius, one of them spotted a faint disturbance near the fence line, a shallow depression in the powder, as if someone had pressed something heavy into the snow and hurriedly covered it. When they brushed the layer aside, the truth emerged. William Anderson's own hunting rifle, the Remington 700 he used on weekend trips with friends and had taught Emma to respect since she was 8 years old. It was lying partially buried, wiped of prints, discarded like someone trying to erase their connection to it. But snow tells the truth even when people don't. The rifle had been placed there hours earlier. The cold metal had melted a thin pocket into the snow, and the prints leading to it were small, too small to belong to an adult male, too small to match the idea of a violent intruder fleeing in panic. Even more suspicious, the bolt-action mechanism showed signs of being cycled multiple times with deliberate force, something an unprepared burglar in a hurry wouldn't bother with. The killer had taken the time to chamber each round calmly, cleanly, without rushing, 3 shots fired with practiced movements. And despite Emma's story, despite her shaking voice and tightly wrapped blanket, investigators knew one thing instantly. The person who fired that rifle understood exactly how to use it. William's friends later confirmed that Emma had grown up around firearms and knew how the bolt mechanism worked. She had practiced with her father under supervision. She knew exactly how to load, fire, and cycle that weapon. The rifle, supposedly used by a stranger, was slowly turning the investigation inward. No fingerprints, no forced entry, no sign of theft. But a familiar gun, handled with familiarity, abandoned in a way that suggested not panic, but calculation. And when detectives returned inside the home, forensic analysis of William's bedroom would expose something even more chilling. The killer hadn't just known how to shoot, they had executed him with precision. William Anderson's bedroom was the only place in the house where chaos lived, but even that chaos felt controlled, shaped by the killer's choices rather than by panic or fear. The moment forensic analysts stepped inside, they knew the first shot had been fired while William was asleep. Blood patterns near the headboard showed no signs of defensive movement before impact. The initial bullet struck his upper chest, likely jolting him awake in a tidal wave of pain and confusion. The overturned nightstand and shattered lamp suggested he tried to rise, tried to defend himself, tried to understand what was happening in the milliseconds before the second shot tore through his shoulder. But here's what investigators couldn't ignore. All 3 shell casings were found within a tight circle near the foot of the bed. The shooter had not moved. They had not panicked. They had stood in one controlled position, firing with eerie stillness. The third and final shot, fired from close range, entered directly into William's heart, a clean, lethal placement. A shot someone makes deliberately, not accidentally. The medical examiner would later state that any one of the shots could have killed him, but the final bullet was execution style. What intruder, surprised to find someone home, stands calmly at the foot of the bed and cycles a bolt-action rifle between shots, taking their time as the victim struggles? What burglar returns to the same stance after the second shot? And what stranger fires a precision heart shot as the final strike? Nothing fit the narrative of a break-in. Everything suggested the killer wasn't scared. They weren't rushed. They weren't improvising. They were completing a task. They were finishing something. William's hands, smeared with his own blood, had faint defensive wounds, marks from a man trying desperately to shield himself from a murderer he likely recognized in his final moments. Because the angle of the shots suggested one devastating truth. The killer stood where a family member would stand, close, unafraid, familiar. But while investigators pieced together the violence inside that bedroom, the outside world was reacting, and the contrast between public grief and private suspicion was about to take the case in a shocking new direction. As news of William Anderson's death spread across Billings, the community reacted with the kind of collective heartbreak usually reserved for public tragedies. Neighbors gathered outside the police tape in their winter coats, whispering in disbelief that something so brutal had happened on their quiet street, and on Christmas morning no less. Parents clutched their children a little tighter, teachers at Williams' school cried openly in their living rooms, and former students flooded social media with messages about the teacher who changed their lives. Candlelight vigils formed within hours. News crews arrived by midday. Reporters spoke about William as a devoted father and beloved educator, painting him as the last person anyone could imagine with enemies. His death didn't make sense to anyone, except the detectives inside that house, who were watching a very different story unfold. Because while the city mourned a respected teacher, investigators privately studied the inconsistencies piling up around Emma Anderson's account. Her tears were too controlled, her movements too deliberate, her shock too manufactured, and every piece of evidence inside the house pointed inward, not outward. Yet because Emma was 16 and appeared fragile, officers were careful, methodical. They didn't accuse, they didn't confront, they simply watched, and what they saw troubled them. When Emma was told she would spend the night at her aunt's house instead of returning home, she didn't break down, she didn't plead. She didn't ask to stay with friends, neighbors, or anyone who comforted her. Instead, she calmly asked what time she needed to be at the station for more questions. Her detachment wasn't grief, it was distance. A kind of emotional flatness that didn't match the horror she was describing. Still, investigators couldn't act on instincts alone. They needed proof, something solid, something undeniable, something that could speak when people lied. And that proof would come from a small device across the street, an ordinary doorbell camera that happened to capture extraordinary evidence in the silent, snowy darkness of Christmas morning. Before detectives could fully understand the crime, they needed to understand the man at the center of it, and the daughter whose life had begun to shift in unsettling ways long before Christmas morning. William Anderson wasn't just a beloved science teacher, he was the kind of father people admired. After losing his wife to cancer 5 years earlier, he had reorganized his entire life to make Emma his priority. He cooked for her, drove her to volleyball practice, helped with school projects, and showed up to every event with the enthusiasm of a man determined to be both mother and father. His home was filled with photos of the two of them hiking, traveling, smiling. To outsiders, theirs looked like a strong, stable bond, one built on routine, trust, and love. But inside the last few months of their life together, cracks had begun to spread. Neighbors recalled hearing arguments, rare for the usually calm father and daughter. Teachers noticed Emma withdrawing, her grades slipping, her attitude shifting from vibrant to distant. Friends whispered that she had become secretive, defensive, and emotionally volatile. William had confided to family members that he felt Emma was changing in ways he couldn't understand. She'd begun hiding her phone, lying about where she was after school, and sneaking out late at night. Something had taken hold of her, or someone, and though William couldn't yet see it clearly, he knew his daughter was keeping a secret, one he was determined to uncover before it harmed her. That growing tension cast a shadow over the weeks leading up to the murder. What had once been a warm home had become a battleground of suspicion and silence. And detectives, now learning about Emma's recent behavior, began questioning whether the Christmas intruder was merely a convenient narrative to cover something darker brewing inside the house. William had been worried about Emma. He sensed danger around her. He sensed she was slipping beyond his reach, but he never imagined how quickly that distance would turn deadly. And everything investigators suspected would suddenly be confirmed by a simple home security device across the street, one that captured the truth Emma never thought anyone would see. Across the street from the Anderson home sat a modest house with a string of dim Christmas lights still glowing in the cold morning air. On its front door was a ring camera, an ordinary device meant to catch package thieves and delivery arrivals. But on this Christmas morning, that simple camera would become the turning point of the entire investigation. When detectives canvassed the neighborhood, the homeowner casually mentioned the camera, unsure if it captured anything useful. But the moment investigators played the footage, the air in the room shifted. The Anderson home was visible from across the street, including a clear view of Emma's bedroom window, and what they saw instantly contradicted her entire story. Between 4:12 a.m. and 5:48 a.m., the window light flickered on and off multiple times, not once, not twice, but in a pattern of deliberate movement. Emma had insisted she slept straight through the night until the gunshots jolted her awake close to 6 o'clock a.m., yet the footage showed what looked like someone pacing, turning lights on and off, moving around the room repeatedly. And the most damning moment came at 4:38 a.m., right in the window of time. The medical examiner later estimated the murder occurred. A shadow passed directly across the glass, a human silhouette. Not fast, not panicked, but slow and steady, as if the person inside was walking with purpose toward the hallway leading to William's bedroom. That single shadow was enough to destroy the idea of a sleeping, terrified teenager. Emma was awake, she was moving. She was active during the time her father was killed. The footage didn't show the crime, but it captured something just as powerful, a lie. For detectives, this was the moment suspicion hardened into certainty. The intruder story was impossible, and once they paired that footage with Emma's phone and Wi-Fi data, the digital trail she thought she'd erased would expose the truth she could no longer outrun. If the Ring camera footage was the first crack in Emma's story, the digital forensics that followed shattered it completely. In modern investigations, phones don't just answer calls, they answer questions. They create timelines, reveal movements, and expose lies with a precision no human memory can match. And Emma Anderson's phone did exactly that. Detectives pulled her device logs, Wi-Fi connections, and background app activity. What they found lined up so perfectly with the Ring footage that it could have been choreographed. At 4:12 a.m., right when her bedroom light first turned on, Emma's phone connected to the Wi-Fi access point in her room, proof she was awake and moving. Minutes later, her phone switched to the kitchen access point, showing she left her room. Then at 4:40 a.m., as the shadow crossed her window, the phone jumped again, this time to the hallway access point. And at 4:43 a.m., almost exactly when the medical examiner believed William was shot, Emma's phone was connected to the access point closest to her father's bedroom. This wasn't a random pattern. This was a digital map of her movements, a breadcrumb trail she didn't realize she was leaving behind. Even more revealing were her deleted searches recovered from her device, pages about how to clean gunshot residue, how to stage a break-in, and how to make a murder look like a robbery gone wrong. She had researched not just the killing, but the cover-up. The timeline was too precise, too clean, too damning. No panicked intruder in the world would run through the house at the exact times the digital evidence showed Emma moving. No burglar would trigger the kitchen Wi-Fi at the same minute Emma did. No stranger would align with her digital fingerprint so perfectly. The house might have been silent that morning, but her electronics were loud, and they told detectives exactly what she didn't want them to know. But the next discovery wouldn't be digital at all. It would be something far more physical, something hidden in a place no frightened daughter should ever think to use. With the digital evidence tightening around Emma's story, detectives turned their attention back to the physical world, to the places where guilty hands leave traces no matter how careful they try to be. And inside Emma Anderson's bedroom, behind the familiar posters and teenage clutter, investigators found something that erased any lingering doubt. Hidden inside a floor vent, accessible only by removing a metal register, lay a balled-up piece of clothing, stuffed deep into the duct as if someone believed darkness could swallow evidence. It was a nightshirt, Emma's nightshirt, and it was stained with blood, not smeared, not brushed, but marked with the kind of high-velocity spatter that occurs only when someone stands close to a gunshot wound. Even worse, the pattern wasn't random. The droplets matched the angle and spray produced by William Anderson's third and fatal heart shot, the execution-level strike that ended his life within seconds. This was not transfer blood from touching a wound. This was not contamination from checking a pulse, as Emma had later claimed. This was spatter, blood cast off into the air and landing on the shooter, and no intruder would have access to Emma's vent. No stranger would know to hide clothing there. Only someone who lived in that room, someone who panicked after firing the final shot, someone who removed the evidence and hid it where they believed no one would ever think to look. Gunshot residue tests sealed the picture further. Traces were found on both of Emma's hands, especially her right palm, her thumb, and between her fingers in a pattern consistent with gripping and firing a bolt-action rifle. She tried to explain it away. She said she had touched her father, touched the bedding, maybe even touched the gun when she found it outside. But residue doesn't lie, and residue doesn't appear in the exact distribution pattern of someone who fired a weapon unless they actually fired it. Piece by piece, the evidence stopped being circumstantial and began to form a brutal, undeniable truth. And when detectives sat Emma down for questioning again, her behavior shifted in a way that revealed something even more chilling than the blood in her mind. When detectives brought Emma Anderson back in for questioning, they expected a frightened teenager, shaking, overwhelmed, desperate for reassurance. But the girl who walked into the interview room didn't match the emotional profile of someone who had just lost her father in a violent, bloody attack. She sat straight, hands folded neatly, eyes watchful rather than wounded, not cold but controlled, too controlled. Detectives began with simple questions, and almost immediately something felt off. Emma answered quickly, too quickly, offering explanations the moment a doubt was raised, adjusting her story with a smoothness that didn't fit the behavior of a traumatized child. When they asked why her bedroom light flicked on and off for nearly 2 hours during the time she claimed she was asleep, she responded instantly, "I probably got up to use the bathroom, or maybe I couldn't sleep." But when confronted with the exact timestamps matching the movements toward the hallway, her answers shifted again. "Maybe I forgot, maybe I left the light on." Each explanation contradicted the last, offered without hesitation, showing a mind not overwhelmed by grief but strategizing. Detectives weren't just listening to what she said, they were watching how she said it. Her voice stayed even, her breathing never spiked, her eyes didn't tear up when discussing the murder. Instead, she kept glancing at the evidence photos, scanning them with a calm intelligence that unnerved even experienced officers. And when they revealed the blood-spattered nightshirt found in her vent, Emma's reaction wasn't shock, it was recalculation. Her face tightened for a moment, then smoothed. "That's impossible," Someone planted it, she said, as if testing a new version of events. It wasn't the claim that disturbed investigators, it was the speed with which she had crafted it. Trauma scrambles the mind, guilt organizes it, and Emma's mind was organizing it every step. Detectives left that room knowing one thing for certain: Emma Anderson wasn't responding like a scared child. She was responding like someone trying to stay ahead of the truth. But the real motive behind that deadly Christmas morning wouldn't be found in her words. It would be found in a secret relationship she never wanted anyone to uncover. As detectives widened their search into Emma Anderson's personal life, one truth rose to the surface like a shadow finally stepping into the light. There was someone older, much older, pulling strings behind the scenes. His name was Jake Mercer, a 23-year-old man who worked at a local electronics store, and to Emma, he wasn't just a secret, he was an obsession. Her friends told investigators that Emma had become a different person ever since Jake entered her world, more withdrawn, more defensive, more reckless, and more willing to lie than anyone had ever seen from her before. Deleted texts recovered from Emma's phone painted a disturbing picture of an illegal relationship hidden behind careful timing, private message apps, coded phrases, and late-night conversations that no teenager should ever be sharing with a grown man. And while Emma was falling deeper into the fantasy of forbidden love, Jake was growing desperate. He wasn't just risking a breakup, he was risking prison. When William Anderson discovered the inappropriate photos and messages between his underage daughter and a 23-year-old adult, he reacted exactly as any protective parent would. He confronted Emma, warned her that the relationship was illegal, and told her he would be going to the police. And that was the moment everything inside Emma's world began to tilt. Jake panicked. His messages shifted from affection to fear, fear of being exposed, fear of losing his freedom, fear of consequences he knew were coming if William followed through. "If your dad turns me in, my life is over," one of his deleted texts read. "Fix this, please." Emma, emotionally tangled and mentally overwhelmed, responded in ways that revealed a dangerous mindset. "I won't let him take you away. I'll take care of it." I promise. These weren't the words of a frightened child. They were the words of someone convincing herself that the impossible had only one solution. The motive was no longer speculation. Jealousy, fear, manipulation, pressure. It was all there, lined up in messages that traced the collapse from teenage infatuation into a deadly decision that would destroy both father and daughter forever. But the most chilling messages were still ahead, the ones that didn't just show panic or fear, but the blueprint of a murder slowly taking shape. When investigators dug deeper into Emma's deleted messages, the story shifted from a troubled teenager under pressure to something far more chilling. These weren't just emotional exchanges. These were instructions, reactions, and ultimately, breadcrumbs of a plan forming long before Christmas morning. One recovered text from Emma read like a turning point. "He said he's calling the cops after Christmas. He showed me the law. Jake, you'll go to prison." That message, sent less than 48 hours before the murder, wasn't filled with fear for her father or confusion about consequences. It was filled with panic for Jake. And minutes later, Jake responded with a sentence that investigators said could be interpreted as the spark that ignited everything. "He can't decide our future. You need to figure this out before he ruins both our lives." It wasn't a command, but it wasn't innocent either. It was pressure, emotional leverage on a vulnerable girl already in over her head. The deleted chain continued. Emma begging, Jake spiraling, both of them imagining a future together that could only exist if William Anderson didn't report the relationship. In one exchange, Emma wrote, "If he does this, everything is over. I'll lose you." And Jake answered, "I love you, but if he destroys this, we both lose." Detectives stared at these messages in silence because while Jake never explicitly said, "Kill him," his fear-driven responses pushed Emma into a corner she wasn't mature enough to stand in. Emma, wrapped in teenage desperation, responded a few hours before the murder with the most haunting message of all: "I won't let him take you away. I'll fix this tonight." Those 8 words became the backbone of the prosecution's case, proof not of a sudden outburst, but of a deliberate shift in Emma's mindset. A decision forming, a plan solidifying, and as the night progressed, her searches matched her messages. How to make a break-in look real, how long gunshot residue lasts, will deleted texts disappear forever. But the plan didn't end with the murder, because investigators soon discovered Emma had prepared for what came next. Money, escape, and a future she thought she'd built on her father's blood. While investigators were still piecing together the emotional and digital motives behind William Anderson's murder, a discovery in Emma's personal belongings uncovered an entirely different layer, one that showed not only intent, but preparation for life after the crime. When detectives examined her laptop and notebooks, they found something that startled even seasoned investigators: pages filled with practice signatures. dozens of attempts to replicate William Anderson's handwriting, specifically his signature used on financial documents. At first glance, it looked like a teenager doodling, but the more detectives studied it, the clearer it became. Emma wasn't doodling, she was preparing. A digital forensics team uncovered the next piece of the puzzle. Hours before the murder, someone had attempted to log into William's online retirement account. Not only logged in, but attempted to transfer $50,000 into a newly created checking account under Emma's name. The bank had flagged the transfer as suspicious due to timing and unusual activity, stopping it from going through. But the attempt was enough to reveal something chilling. Emma hadn't just planned the murder, she'd planned her future beyond it. And the trail didn't stop there. Detectives found online searches about opening accounts without parental approval, searches on how long it takes banks to verify transfers, and even browsing for apartments in Washington state, just miles away from where Jake Mercer lived. It was the first concrete proof of her anticipated escape plan. Emma didn't envision staying in Montana after the crime. She envisioned freedom with Jake, a new life built on stolen money and a dead man's silence. Prosecutors later said this section of evidence was one of the most damning because it moved Emma's motive from emotional desperation to financial calculation. It showed forethought, planning, intent. And worst of all, it showed she believed everything would simply fall into place once her father was gone. But detectives were about to uncover even more, because her digital movements didn't just show why she killed, they revealed exactly how she executed every step of that deadly Christmas morning. As investigators layered the evidence together, Emma Anderson's movements inside her home on Christmas morning came into focus like a time-stamped roadmap of murder, mapped not by eyewitnesses, but by technology she never imagined would betray her. The Ring camera proved she wasn't asleep, but the Wi-Fi logs, phone pings, and background app connections showed something even more damning, a minute-by-minute digital shadow of her actions. At 4:12 a.m., Emma's phone activated her bedroom's Wi-Fi node, the moment her light flicked on in the Ring footage. She was awake, she was moving. At 4:36 a.m., the phone jumped to the kitchen access point. The only reason for that shift was physical movement. She had left her room. She had walked down the hall. And chillingly, that timestamp matched the exact moment detectives believe she retrieved the rifle from the gun's safe. Then came the final sequence, the one that sealed her fate. At 4:40 a.m., the phone connected to the hallway access point, the same moment the Ring camera captured a shadow crossing Emma's window. And at 4:43 a.m., almost perfectly aligned with the medical examiner's estimated time of the first shot, Emma's phone connected to the Wi-Fi node closest to her father's bedroom. It wasn't just coincidence. It wasn't just a pattern, it was a confession written in data. Even after the murder, her movements stayed digital. At 4:52 a.m., her phone returned to the bedroom access point. At 5:10 a.m., it showed activity consistent with pacing. At 5:48 a.m., the lights flicked again, captured on camera, matched by the digital logs. She didn't call 911 until 6:27 a.m., meaning she moved through that house for nearly 2 hours after shooting her father, cleaning, staging, hiding evidence, and rehearsing her story. The technology didn't lie, it didn't forget, and where Emma's words twisted and shifted, her digital footprint stayed brutally accurate. This was not a frantic, terrified child running for help. This was someone completing a plan. And while investigators were assembling the digital truth, the man she killed for the 23-year-old boyfriend was leaving his own trail, one that would drag him into the heart of the investigation next. While investigators were assembling the timeline of Emma Anderson's movements, another figure lurked at the edges of the case, a man who hadn't set foot inside the house that morning, yet whose presence shaped every decision she made. Jake Mercer, the 23-year-old man Emma was willing to kill for, wasn't just an emotional influence. He was a digital shadow, leaving traces he never intended anyone to find. When detectives subpoenaed his phone records, the first shock came immediately. Jake's phone pinged off a tower less than half a mile from the Anderson home between 3:30 a.m. and 4:05 a.m., right before the killing. His alibi claiming he'd been home asleep collapsed instantly, but the deeper investigators dug, the darker the pattern became. 3 days before the murder, Jake had purchased a burner phone, a prepaid device unconnected to his main number. That burner phone connected to the cell tower closest to the Anderson house at 4:10 a.m., almost exactly when Emma's phone showed her leaving her room. Minutes later, it disconnected forever, shut off permanently, never used again. The symbolism was unmistakable. He stayed close but not too close, guiding Emma through messages, ready to be nearby if things went wrong, then erasing his digital trace the moment the crime window opened. It wasn't enough to charge him with pulling the trigger, but it was more than enough to prove he was entangled in the planning, emotionally, psychologically, and possibly physically. Investigators also uncovered chilling patterns in his chats with Emma: sudden silences when she hinted at backing out, emotional manipulation when she wavered, and bursts of panic whenever William threatened to expose him. A 23-year-old man doesn't text a teenage girl, "Don't let him take this from us," unless he knows exactly what she might do. And even though Jake insisted later that he never meant for Emma to kill her father, his movements told another story. He was close enough to run, but not close enough to stop anything. His presence that night wasn't an accident, it was strategy. But the most chilling moment of the investigation hadn't happened yet, because Emma's own confession would take the case from suspicion to certainty and reveal a mindset investigators never expected from a 16-year-old girl. When detectives finally confronted Emma Anderson in the interrogation room, armed with the digital timeline, the ring footage, the hidden nightshirt, and the messages with Jake, what happened next stunned even the most seasoned investigators. They expected tears, a breakdown, denial, fear, anything resembling the emotional collapse of a 16-year-old cornered by evidence. But Emma didn't crumble. She calculated. She adjusted. She shifted her story again and again with unnerving speed, each lie crafted to fill the gap created by the last one. Officers recognized the pattern instantly. She wasn't remembering, she was building. But then came the moment everything changed. When detectives placed the printout of her incriminating texts on the table, the messages where she promised to fix this tonight, something inside Emma's expression cracked. Not in fear, not in guilt, but in recognition. She knew this was the point she could no longer talk her way out of, and her voice, which had been steady throughout the interrogation, softened into something eerily calm as she finally said, "He was going to ruin everything." Those were the first words she uttered that resembled a confession. What followed wasn't a tearful apology or a spiraling breakdown. Instead, Emma described the events of Christmas morning with a detachment that left the room cold. She admitted going to the gun safe. She admitted loading the rifle. She admitted standing at the foot of her father's bed for what felt like a long time before firing the first shot. She spoke about it as if she were describing someone else's actions, as if she were recalling a science experiment, not the murder of the man who raised her. She said she felt nothing when she pulled the trigger. She said the second and third shots were necessary so he wouldn't suffer. And when detectives asked her why she didn't run for help, she replied flatly, "I had things to finish." Even veteran officers later admitted her emotional disconnect was among the most disturbing things they'd ever witnessed in an interrogation. But as shocking as her confession was, the next stage would be even more explosive, because the courtroom was about to hear every detail, and the battle over whether a teenager should die in prison was about to begin. With Emma Anderson's confession recorded and the digital evidence stacked beyond dispute, the case moved into its next, and perhaps most contentious, phase, preparing a 16-year-old girl to stand trial for the premeditated murder of her father. Prosecutors knew they had a mountain of evidence, but they also knew the single fact that complicated everything: Emma was a minor. The justice system doesn't take that lightly, even in cases drenched in brutality. And this wasn't just any murder, it was patricide on Christmas morning, committed with precision, planning, and chilling emotional detachment. The question looming over the courtroom wasn't whether Emma killed her father. It was how the law should treat someone her age who committed a crime with such adult-level calculation. Prosecutors argued she had to be tried as an adult. The evidence showed weeks of planning. Staged break-in research, gun residue cleanup instructions, forged signature practice, attempted money transfers, and a methodical execution of her father. This, they said, wasn't the impulsive act of a panicked teenager. It was the cold determination of someone who fully understood the consequences. The defense, however, prepared an entirely different strategy. They leaned heavily on adolescent psychology, the influence of an older boyfriend, and the notion that Emma's emotional immaturity made her more vulnerable to manipulation than motive. They framed Jake Mercer as a predator who twisted Emma's judgment and used fear to drive her into a catastrophic decision. The courtroom was poised for a collision of narratives, one portraying Emma as a calculating killer, the other as a child whose brain was still forming, manipulated into believing murder was her only escape. And outside the courthouse, the community was cracking in half. Some saw Emma as a monster. Others saw her as another victim in a chain of exploitation. Reporters lined the courthouse steps. Parents debated at cafe tables. Former students of William Anderson prepared statements about the teacher who shaped their futures. The trial was no longer just a legal event. It was becoming a national conversation about juvenile justice, parental protection, and the dangerous power of digital footprints. But nothing would ignite stronger reactions than what happened once the trial began, because when Emma stepped into the courtroom, The secrets, testimonies, and evidence that followed would leave the jury stunned. When the trial of Emma Anderson officially opened, the courtroom transformed into a stage where every secret, every lie, and every digital footprint would be dissected in front of 12 strangers tasked with deciding whether a 16-year-old should spend the rest of her life behind bars. Prosecutors entered with confidence. The evidence was overwhelming, the confession chilling, and the motive undeniable. They framed the case not as a tragic teenage mistake, but as a calculated execution rooted in fear, manipulation, financial motive, and emotional coldness. Their opening statement described a girl who planned her father's murder with the patience of someone far older, researching break-ins, rehearsing stories, studying gun residue, practicing signatures, and retrieving a rifle she knew exactly how to use. The jury listened in stunned silence. The defense strategy unfolded in an entirely different tone. They painted Emma as a vulnerable child groomed by a 23-year-old man who systematically chipped away at her judgment, steering her into isolation and emotional dependency. They argued that adolescent brains are wired for impulsivity, not reasoning, that Emma's age made her incapable of fully understanding the permanence of her actions. They asked the jury to see her not as a killer, but as a manipulated minor caught in the web of an adult predator. And while the courtroom was divided, Emma's demeanor didn't help her defense. She sat motionless, expression neutral, eyes hollow, offering no visible grief for the father she had lost, nor fear for the future she was facing. Jurors glanced at her often, searching for signs of humanity. Instead, they saw composure that felt unsettling. After opening statements, the first witnesses took the stand, a neighbor who heard nothing but saw everything through his Ring camera, a forensic expert who explained the Wi-Fi logs that mapped Emma's movements, a medical examiner who described William Anderson's final moments with clinical precision. Each testimony built a clearer picture. This was not a crime of panic, it was a crime of intention. But the most powerful witnesses were still to come, and once Emma's inner circle began speaking, the courtroom would hear details that even seasoned jurors weren't prepared for. As the trial moved into its most critical phase, the prosecution began presenting the kind of evidence that doesn't just speak, it shouts. The jury had already heard about the Ring camera and the broken timeline of Emma's alibi. But now, experts were called to explain each piece in a way that left no room for doubt. First came the digital forensics specialist, who walked the jury through Emma's Wi-Fi connections, phone pings, and deleted browsing history. The courtroom watched the giant screen as he pointed to timestamps: 4:12 a.m., 4:36 a.m., 4:40 a.m., 4:43 a.m., each one a digital footprint linking Emma to the exact places she denied being. Jurors leaned forward, their faces tightening as they realized the data was essentially reconstructing Emma's steps with minute-by-minute precision. Then came the ballistics expert, explaining how a bolt-action rifle requires deliberate motion between each shot. Not panic, not reflex, deliberation. The 3 shots fired in consistent position and rhythm showed a steady hand and a controlled mind. This wasn't frantic shooting, this was execution. After that, a blood spatter analyst detailed the pattern found on Emma's hidden nightshirt, explaining that the fine mist of blood wasn't from touching the body, but from being near the fatal shot as blood erupted into the air. The jury went silent as they heard that Emma would have had to stand within feet of her father when the final bullet entered his heart. Then came the financial analyst, who revealed attempts to transfer $50,000 from William's account. He explained how Emma had practiced forging her father's signature and opened a new account in her own name, actions that proved she wasn't just eliminating an obstacle, she was preparing for life after the crime. By the time the prosecutor finished presenting the evidence, jurors looked visibly shaken. The defense team's arguments about teenage impulsivity were still valid, but they were now competing against a mountain of proof that showed planning, structure, and intent the jury couldn't ignore. Yet nothing impacted the courtroom more than the people who took the stand next, the ones who knew William and Emma personally, and whose testimonies revealed the emotional truth behind the crime. When the prosecution shifted from technical experts to personal witnesses, the atmosphere in the courtroom changed completely. Data and digital footprints might convince the mind, but human stories, raw and unfiltered, strike the heart. And these witnesses brought emotion the jury couldn't ignore. First to testify was William Anderson's sister, Catherine Walsh. Her voice trembled as she described her brother as a devoted single father who had poured everything into raising Emma after losing his wife. She told the jury how William stayed up late helping with school projects, never missed a volleyball game, and even turned down promotions so he could be home more. Her voice cracked when she shared their last conversation. William had told her he was worried about Emma's secrecy, her behavior, and the older man he had just discovered she was seeing. He wasn't angry, Catherine said through tears. He was scared for her, he wanted to protect her. Jurors wiped their eyes, some glancing at Emma, who sat motionless, hands folded, showing no visible reaction. Then came Emma's former friend, who described how Emma changed after meeting Jake Mercer, how she became secretive, distant, unpredictable. She recalled Emma saying she wished her father would stop controlling everything, a sentence that sounded like teenage frustration at the time, but rang differently in the courtroom. Next was one of William's colleagues, a teacher who spoke about William's kindness, patience, and dedication. She shared how William joked that raising a teenage daughter was the hardest chemistry problem he'd ever faced, but he loved Emma fiercely and never gave up on her. Then the prosecution called Jake Mercer. The room went cold. He looked nervous, ashamed, and defensive. He admitted to being in a relationship with Emma while she was underage. He admitted William confronted them. And though he denied directly encouraging murder, his messages told a different story, messages full of pressure, fear, and manipulation. His presence reinforced what prosecutors argued all along. Emma wasn't just rebelling, she believed she was saving the future of a man who had everything to lose. By the end of witness testimony, the jury wasn't just analyzing evidence, they were feeling the emotional devastation of a family destroyed from within. And yet the most explosive moment was still to come, because Emma herself would soon take the stand, revealing a side of her that the jury was not prepared for. When Emma Anderson stepped up to the witness stand, the entire courtroom seemed to shift. For weeks, jurors had heard about her texts, her searches, her movements, her lies, but they had not yet heard from her, and this moment would become the most defining and unsettling turning point of the trial. Emma walked to the stand slowly, dressed in a simple navy dress chosen by her defense team to make her look younger, softer, more vulnerable. She kept her hands tightly folded, her expression blank, almost eerily calm for a teenager on trial for murdering her father. When the defense began questioning her, Emma spoke in a soft, steady voice. She described her childhood, her father's love, and the loneliness she felt after her mother passed away. She spoke of struggling to fit in, of feeling misunderstood, and of finding attention, undeserved but intoxicating, when Jake Mercer entered her life. She painted him as a savior, someone who really listened and made her feel alive. But when her testimony turned toward the night of the murder, something shifted. The softness vanished. She described retrieving the rifle as if narrating a routine task. She described standing in her father's doorway for a long time, waiting for the right moment. She said she felt numb and that the first shot just happened. The courtroom froze as she explained the second and third shots with chilling detachment. No trembling voice, no breakdown, no emotion, just memory cold and organized. Her defense attorney asked if she regretted it. Emma answered, "I regret that everything fell apart the way it did." The jury caught it instantly. She wasn't grieving her father, she was grieving the consequences. Then came the prosecution's cross-examination, slicing through her narrative like a blade. They replayed her texts, they repeated her searches, they confronted her with her own words. And with each question, Emma didn't fall apart. She adjusted, recalculated, and rationalized. Her emotional detachment, meant to look controlled, now looked frighteningly like indifference. By the time she stepped down, the jury's faces told the story. They didn't see a manipulated child. They saw a girl capable of planning, lying, and justifying murder. And the moment of truth was coming fast. Next, the jury would decide whether a 16-year-old should spend the rest of her life behind bars. When the jury finally retreated to deliberate, the courtroom fell into a stillness so heavy it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Reporters pressed against the glass outside. William Anderson's colleagues and former students clutched each other's hands. Emma sat at the defense table, expression unreadable, her posture as rigid as it had been from the start. Hours passed. Then more hours, and with each ticking minute, the divide between those who saw Emma as a cold-blooded murderer and those who saw her as a manipulated child grew sharper. But after 14 hours, the jury returned, filed in slowly, faces grim, carrying the weight of a decision that would change the course of a young girl's life forever. The judge asked the foreperson to rise. She did. Her voice shook not from uncertainty, but from the gravity of speaking a truth no one in that room could take back. We, the jury, find the defendant, Emma Louise Anderson, guilty of murder in the first degree. Gasps rippled across the courtroom. Catherine Walsh, William's sister, closed her eyes and let tears fall silently, not out of triumph, but out of the tragic finality of losing both her brother and her niece in the same moment. Emma's reaction was stranger. Her face didn't crumble, didn't twist with emotion, didn't reflect fear or anger. Instead, she went pale, almost ghostly, as if the meaning of the words had hit her in a way she hadn't imagined possible. For the first time, she seemed frightened. Her chest rose and fell faster, her fingers trembling slightly against the tabletop. The judge asked each juror to confirm the verdict individually. One by one, they did. Some looked at Emma with sorrow, others with stern resolve, but all 12 agreed. When the verdict was finalized, Emma stared ahead, no tears, no outburst, just a hollow realization settling into her eyes. She wasn't going home again, but the verdict wasn't the end. The next phase would decide the rest of her life, because the sentencing was where the judge would deliver the words she never expected to hear: life without parole. 2 weeks after the guilty verdict, the Yellowstone County Courthouse filled once again, this time with an atmosphere even heavier than before. Verdicts declare guilt, but sentencing declares destiny. And Emma Anderson, now 16 but carrying a burden far older, walked into the courtroom with the knowledge that her future hung on the words of a single judge. The room was packed. Reporters lined the back wall. William's former students sat shoulder to shoulder, some clutching photos of the man who had changed their lives. His sister, Catherine Walsh, held a prepared statement with trembling hands. Emma sat beside her attorney, staring at the table, the same blank expression masking whatever storm churned beneath the surface. When it was time for victim impact statements, Catherine stepped forward first. Her voice cracked as she spoke about her brother, the devoted teacher, the patient father, the man whose entire world revolved around giving Emma stability and love. He raised her alone, she said through tears. He sacrificed everything. And his reward was 3 bullets from the daughter he protected. The courtroom fell silent. Even the judge's eyes softened. The prosecutor argued for the maximum penalty, life without parole, emphasizing the planning, the motive, the manipulation, the cold execution, and Emma's chilling lack of remorse. The defense fought back, pleading for leniency, insisting Emma was still a child, still forming, still capable of rehabilitation. They emphasized Jake Mercer's influence, the emotional manipulation, the vulnerability of adolescent psychology. Then the judge turned to Emma and asked if she wished to speak. For the first time in the entire trial, she hesitated. She stood slowly, her voice thin, her words carefully chosen. "I know what I did was wrong," she said. "I didn't understand everything. I was scared. I miss my dad." But the words didn't carry the weight of genuine remorse. They felt distant, rehearsed, hollow. The judge listened. And when Emma sat down, the courtroom braced itself. Then came the ruling, slow, deliberate, final. "Emma Louise Anderson, you are sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." Emma's face drained of color. Her composure finally cracked. For the first time, fear bloomed across her features. This wasn't a story. This wasn't a courtroom exercise. This was her life gone, but the story didn't end at sentencing. What happened in the months that followed revealed the full emotional cost of the crime, and the haunting aftermath left behind for everyone connected to the Anderson family. In the days that followed Emma Anderson's sentencing, Billings, Montana found itself living inside the quiet echo of a tragedy too heavy for a small town to absorb. Christmas decorations still clung to porches, long after the holiday spirit had been replaced with grief, confusion, and an ache no one could quite articulate. The Anderson home, once filled with the warmth of a father and daughter navigating life together, now sat empty, wrapped in silence and yellowed memories. No one wanted to buy it. No one wanted to touch the place where such betrayal had taken root. William's sister, Catherine Walsh, carried the unbearable burden of closing the door on her family's life there. She boxed up photos, school certificates, broken ornaments, and the remnants of a home that had once echoed with laughter. In each room, she found pieces of the brother she'd lost and the niece she could no longer recognize. For the community, the emotional wound spread far beyond the crime scene. Students at Billings West High School created a memorial wall for their beloved teacher, leaving handwritten notes, chemistry doodles, and stories about the man who inspired them to dream bigger. They cried not just for the teacher they lost, but for the father whose love was repaid with unimaginable violence. Meanwhile, Emma was transferred to the Montana Women's Prison, her new world a stark contrast to the decorated bedroom she had once slept in just feet from the man she killed. The cold concrete and metal doors stripped away the illusion of control she once clung to. Gone were the secret messages, the late-night fantasies of escape, the imagined future with Jake Mercer. Reality was steel, routine, and silence. And for the first time, Emma began to unravel. The weight of her choices, once held back by denial and teenage certainty, now crashed over her in relentless waves. She wasn't the mastermind anymore. She wasn't the girl planning her future. She was inmate number 48,216, a child who made an adult decision and now faced an adult sentence. But the story of Emma and Jake wasn't finished, not yet, because outside prison walls, the man she killed for was about to face a reckoning of his own. While Emma Anderson began serving the first days of a life sentence, the man she had been willing to destroy her world for, Jake Mercer, was was facing his own reckoning. He wasn't behind bars for the murder. He hadn't fired the rifle, but the ripple effect of the crime washed over him like a stain that refused to fade. In the immediate aftermath of the trial, Jake fled Billings. He quit his job at the electronics store without notice, packed what little he had, and drove hundreds of miles west, trying to outrun the ghost of a crime he insisted he didn't commit. But distance couldn't erase digital footprints, and it couldn't erase public opinion. Emma's confession in the trial placed him at the center of national outrage, not as a shooter, but as the adult who manipulated a vulnerable teenager, fueled her desperation, and stood just close enough to avoid the gunshot, but far enough to escape responsibility in the eyes of the law. He was never charged with murder. Legally, there wasn't enough evidence to prove he planned or encouraged the killing directly, but socially, morally, and publicly, he became a pariah. His involvement with a 15-year-old girl before her 16th birthday made him a predator in the eyes of the world. Employers who once skimmed his resume now Googled his name and closed their doors. Landlords refused to rent to him. Neighbors whispered. Former coworkers avoided him. The digital age remembers everything, and Jake Mercer's name was now permanently burned into one of the most disturbing juvenile murder cases Montana had ever seen. Even in Seattle, where he tried to rebuild his life, the shadow followed him. Jobs disappeared the moment background checks were run. His phone number changed again and again. His online accounts were shut down. And at night, friends later said, he spoke as though haunted, not by the crime he denied orchestrating, but by the reality that Emma Anderson had killed her father for a future that never existed. A future he abandoned the moment things went dark. But inside prison walls, Emma wasn't thinking of Jake anymore. The next chapter would reveal who she became after the trial, and how the weight of her choices finally began to crush her. As the months passed inside the Montana women's prison, the sharp edges of Emma Anderson's defiance began to dull. The teenager who once maneuvered through lies with unnerving confidence now found herself swallowed by the monotony, the noise, and the crushing permanence of life behind steel doors. Prison doesn't run on emotion, it runs on routine, and routine has a way of stripping away illusions. Mornings began with cold floors and counted steps. Days were measured by meals, headcounts, and the echo of metal doors clanging shut. Nights were filled with thoughts she could no longer escape. No messages from Jake, no escape plan, no justifications, no future she thought she had secured, just silence. And for the first time, Emma was forced to sit with her choices. In therapy sessions, she started unraveling, not dramatically, but quietly. The facade she carried through the trial had no place in a world where every inmate had their own story, their own regrets, their own ghosts. Some inmates pitied her, a child among adults. Others resented her, a murderer who took her father's life but cried only for her own future. Slowly, Emma began to show pieces of something the public never saw: remorse. Not the polished remorse she attempted in court, but real, raw, unorganized guilt, the kind that comes late, when the weight of consequences finally breaks through teenage stubbornness and emotional blindness. She enrolled in educational programs, earned credits toward a degree, and started to talk, really talk about what happened, not with defiance, not with excuses, but with painful clarity about her manipulation, her immaturity, and the irreversible damage she caused. She admitted she had believed Jake would stay. She admitted she thought she could control everything. She admitted she never considered what her father felt in those final moments. She admitted she didn't understand the finality of death, until now, living inside a sentence with no end. Prison didn't just confine her, it matured her. Slowly, painfully, and far too late. But the legacy of the case didn't end with Emma's transformation. The world outside was changing too. The final part reveals how her crime reshaped laws, debates, and the way society sees juvenile killers. A decade after the murder that shattered a family and stunned an entire community, the case of Emma Anderson no longer lived solely in the courtroom, where her fate was sealed. It lived in classrooms, in legal journals, in debates about justice, technology, and the minds of young offenders. What began as a shocking Christmas tragedy grew into a national conversation about how far the justice system should go when a minor commits an adult-level crime. On one side were advocates who argued that Emma's sentence, life without the possibility of parole, was a necessary response to a meticulously planned killing. They pointed to the digital evidence, the staged break-in, the financial plotting, and the emotional detachment that defined her actions. They said the community deserved protection, and William Anderson deserved justice. On the other side were reformers who saw Emma as a symbol of the complex, often misunderstood psychology of teenagers. They argued she was manipulated by a much older man, driven by fear and immaturity, and her brain wasn't fully developed, scientifically incapable of long-term reasoning or impulse control. Her case was cited in state Senate hearings, referenced in academic research, and debated in law schools across the country. Judges and attorneys pointed to it when discussing the role of digital footprints in modern investigations, the ethics of sentencing juveniles to die in prison, and the extent to which technology can expose the truth behind a lie. Meanwhile, the city of Billings quietly rebuilt. The high school created a memorial garden for William Anderson, a place where students studied, reflected, and honored the teacher whose life had been cut short. Scholarship funds in his name helped young scientists pursue dreams he once nurtured, and those who knew him kept his memory alive not through the horror of his final moments, but through the legacy of his kindness and the passion he brought to his work. As for Emma, she grew older behind bars, no longer the girl seen in courtroom sketches, but a woman shaped by a lifetime of consequences. Her name became a permanent marker in the broader story of juvenile crime. Her case remained a reminder of how love, manipulation, fear, and technology converged to create one of the most haunting crimes Montana had ever seen. And in the end, the story of Emma and William Anderson stood as both a warning and a lesson, a tragedy carved into the intersection of family, justice, and the irreversible cost of one choice made before dawn on Christmas morning. Long after the courtroom closed, and Emma Anderson settled into the bleak rhythm of prison life, her case found new life in a place far from steel doors and concrete corridors, the appeal courts. No matter how final a sentence sounds, the legal system always leaves space for one last question. Was justice applied correctly? Emma's new attorneys believed that question still had weight. They argued that a life without parole sentence for a 16-year-old was too severe, even for a crime as calculated as hers. They pointed to psychological research, Supreme Court precedents, and evolving national standards on juvenile punishment. They insisted Emma's brain was still developing, that teenage decision-making is fundamentally flawed, and that her emotional vulnerability made her an easy target for manipulation by someone older and more experienced. They argued that the original trial focused too heavily on evidence of planning, without acknowledging the psychological pressure of an adult relationship she wasn't mature enough to navigate. And in a surprising twist, the public's perception began to shift. National documentaries, legal analysts, and advocacy groups spotlighted her case, using it as a lightning rod in debates about juvenile justice reform. Some saw her as a child killer, others saw her as a child victim. The Montana Court of Appeals agreed to review the sentence, not the conviction, but the punishment itself. Suddenly, a door Emma believed had been slammed shut forever cracked open again. The legal question wasn't whether she was guilty. It was whether a teenager, no matter how cold her actions seemed, should be sentenced to die behind bars with no chance at rehabilitation. Inside prison, Emma received the news in stunned silence. She wasn't hopeful. Hope had been burned out of her long ago. But she listened. She paid attention. For the first time since sentencing, she felt the faintest tremor of possibility. Not freedom, but reconsideration. Not a new life, but maybe a new ending. But as the appeal moved forward, a new problem emerged, new psychological evaluations that would redefine who Emma was and whether she could ever be trusted again. As the appeals process gained momentum, the court ordered a fresh psychological evaluation, a deep, intrusive examination meant to answer one crucial question: who is Emma Anderson now? Not the girl who stood in her father's bedroom with a rifle, not the teenager who shifted stories in an interrogation room, but the woman she was becoming after years of confinement, therapy, and the crushing weight of a life sentence. A team of forensic psychologists entered the prison, carrying clipboards, questionnaires, and decades of expertise in understanding criminal behavior. They weren't there to judge the crime, only the mind behind it. They interviewed Emma for hours, exploring her childhood, her mother's death, her bond with her father, and the emotional dependence she had formed around Jake Mercer. They studied the trauma she never processed at age 11 when her mother died, the rebellion that grew quietly inside her, and the manipulation she failed to recognize from a man nearly a decade older. They also analyzed her actions on Christmas morning, her chilling confession, and her emotional detachment during the trial. But what stunned them most wasn't the coldness of her past, it was the transformation inside the present. Years in prison had stripped away the layers of teenage bravado and emotional immaturity. Therapy had forced her to face truths she avoided for years. Isolation had removed the influence of Jake, the man who once shaped every thought she acted on. The evaluators saw remorse that wasn't rehearsed, guilt that wasn't performed, and insight she didn't possess at 16. They didn't excuse the murder, not for a second, but they noted something important. Emma's brain at 16 was not Emma's brain at 21. Her emotional regulation had changed. Her reasoning had matured. Her capacity for empathy had grown. She was no longer the person who pulled the trigger. Their report stated one line that would ignite controversy across the legal world. Emma Anderson shows significant psychological development and is no longer a danger in the ways she was at 16. But just as the evaluation painted a picture of growth, a new threat emerged, because someone from Emma's past resurfaced with information that could destroy her appeal completely. Just as Emma's appeal team began gaining traction, a figure she believed she would never see or hear from again stepped out of the shadows: Jake Mercer, the man whose messages formed the emotional backbone of her motive, the man whose presence hovered near the crime scene, the man she killed her father for, only to be abandoned by him the moment consequences arrived. Jake had lived quietly since the trial, changing cities, jobs, and even names in an attempt to outrun the digital ghost of the case. But anonymity was a fragile shield, and as Emma's appeal gained national attention, Jake resurfaced, this time not as a romantic figure, but as a potential witness ready to protect himself at any cost. His sudden reappearance came through a letter sent to the Montana Court of Appeals, claiming Emma's new psychological evaluation was misleading, and that she was fully aware of what she was doing that night. He insisted she had acted independently, without any pressure or manipulation from him. It was a desperate attempt to rewrite history, one designed to separate his name from hers before the appeal revived public interest. Investigators quickly identified inconsistencies in his statement. His claims contradicted earlier messages, contradicted his trial testimony, contradicted his digital footprint. Yet his words still mattered, because in appeals, even the whisper of contradiction can destabilize progress. Emma's attorneys immediately recognized the danger. Jake wasn't trying to hurt Emma out of revenge or guilt. He was doing it to protect himself from renewed scrutiny. If her appeal succeeded, if her case gained more attention, his past could be dragged back into the spotlight. And he knew it. The court now had to weigh not only Emma's psychological growth, but also the sudden reemergence of a man whose involvement had shaped the crime. Emma, meanwhile, reacted with something unexpected: sadness, not love, not longing, but the sorrow of someone finally seeing, with adult clarity, the very manipulation she once mistook for devotion. And her attorneys realized something crucial: Jake's interference might not weaken the appeal, because what happened next would shift the legal strategy entirely, exposing the full extent of Jake's influence, using his own words and digital trail against him. Jake Mercer's sudden attempt to rewrite his role in the murder didn't weaken Emma Anderson's appeal. It ignited a new strategy her attorneys had been hesitant to use until now. For years, the legal team had avoided placing too much blame on Jake. They worried it would make Emma look like she was avoiding responsibility. But Jake's letter, dripping with denial and contradictions, changed everything. It gave them a target, and more importantly, it exposed a pattern they could prove. The appeal team began reconstructing every message, every location ping, every burner phone action Jake had taken in the weeks leading up to the murder. They created a timeline showing how Jake's fear escalated the moment William Anderson threatened to report him, a fear that fueled manipulative messages disguised as affection. They highlighted the emotional pressure Jake placed on Emma, the way he created an us versus the world narrative that isolated her from friends and family. They showed the court how a 23-year-old man formed a psychological hold over a 15-year-old girl, guiding her decisions not through direct orders, but through carefully chosen words that played on teenage insecurity and fear of abandonment. And then they brought out the most damning evidence: the burner phone Jake purchased 3 days before the murder, the device that pinged near Emma's house at 4:10 a.m., the device that shut off forever minutes before William Anderson was killed, the device Jake lied about owning during the original investigation. Suddenly, Jake's letter looked less like truth and more like panic, a desperate attempt to distance himself from a crime he didn't commit but undeniably influenced. Emma's attorneys argued that Jake's behavior didn't absolve her, but it contextualized her. This wasn't a cold-blooded adult making a calculated move. This was a teenager trapped in the emotional gravity of someone older, someone who knew exactly what he stood to lose. The appeal now had teeth: psychological, digital, emotional, and Jake had unknowingly handed them the ammunition. But just as the appeal strategy sharpened, a new storm approached, because the victim's family, still grieving, was about to push back harder than ever before. As Emma's legal team sharpened their strategy and national attention reignited around the case, there was one group that refused to let the narrative shift: William Anderson's family. To them, no appeal, no psychological report, and no argument about Emma's age could overshadow the brutal reality of what had happened on Christmas morning. William wasn't just a victim in a legal case. He was a brother, a teacher, a mentor, and a protector. and their grief was still as raw as the day they learned he had been murdered by the daughter he cherished. His sister, Catherine Walsh, who had spoken so painfully at sentencing, stepped forward once again, determined to ensure Emma's sentence remained untouched. She filed formal statements to the appeals court, describing the devastation Emma had caused, the stolen future William should have had, the trauma inflicted on their family, the emotional fallout that spread across their community. Catherine argued that while Emma might be older now, nothing could erase the fact that she had planned her father's death with a level of calculation rarely seen even in adult offenders. She reminded the court that William had been a loving father who had done everything humanly possible to guide Emma through adolescence, only to pay with his life. And she questioned how Emma's supposed transformation could ever outweigh the horror of what she had done. The prosecution team, still emotionally invested in the case, submitted their own opposition. They emphasized that the sentence was not arbitrary. It was a response to the depth of planning, the precision of the attack, and the chilling lack of remorse shown for months afterward. They argued that maturity earned in prison does not negate responsibility, and that some crimes are so severe, so deeply rooted in betrayal, that society must draw a hard line, even for juveniles. The courtroom now became a battleground of narrative and morality, rehabilitation versus retribution, development versus consequence, forgiveness versus justice. The judges faced immense pressure, not only from legal scholars, but from a grieving family demanding closure. And while the court weighed these emotional and legal arguments, another force, public opinion, was about to erupt in a way that pushed the case into national controversy once again. As the appeals court wrestled with legal arguments and emotional testimonies, another wave of influence crashed into the case, public opinion, louder and more divided than ever before. What had once been a local tragedy in Billings, Montana, now exploded into a national debate fueled by documentaries, podcasts, news panels, and social media firestorms. The story had everything the public clung to. A teenage killer, a murdered single father, a manipulative older boyfriend, digital evidence, and a sentence that pushed the limits of juvenile punishment. And people didn't just care, they chose sides. On one side were those who saw Emma Anderson as a cold, calculating murderer who executed her father with chilling precision. They pointed to the planning, the financial motive, the lies, the confession, and the complete lack of remorse she showed during the trial. To them, life without parole wasn't just justified, it was necessary, a boundary, a warning, a line society shouldn't back away from. On the other side were those who believed her age mattered, that brain science mattered, that teenage vulnerability mattered. They argued she was a child groomed by an adult predator, forced into choices her immature mind couldn't fully understand. They insisted the justice system should not condemn a 16-year-old to die in prison. Debates raged on talk shows. Should children be held to adult standards? Is life without parole moral for juveniles? Was Emma a monster or a manipulated minor? Advocacy groups organized campaigns. Protests formed outside the courthouse. Some held signs saying, "Justice for William." Others held signs reading, "Kids deserve second chances." The tension grew so intense that the appeals court was forced to issue a statement reminding the public that judicial decisions would not be swayed by protests, pressure, or politics. But everyone knew the truth. Public opinion always mattered. It shaped narratives. It shaped policy. And in a case already walking the razor's edge between justice and mercy, it added a volatile new layer. And while the public argued loudly, something much quieter and far more dangerous was happening behind the scenes. A leak from inside the prison that threatened to expose Emma's private life once again. While national debates raged outside prison walls, a quieter storm gathered inside the Montana women's prison, one with the power to derail Emma Anderson's appeal and place her directly in harm's way. It began with a small leak, a single unauthorized photo smuggled out of the facility and posted anonymously to a true crime forum. The photo showed Emma sitting alone at a metal table in the common area, wearing standard prison uniform, her expression unreadable. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't violent, but it was enough. Within hours, the image spread across the internet, shared by bloggers, commentators, and strangers who saw the appeal as an opportunity to resurrect the sensational narrative of the Christmas daughter killer. Some mocked her appearance. Some posted threats, others began speculating that she was receiving special treatment, a claim completely untrue but dangerous in the eyes of inmates. Inside the prison, whispers intensified. Inmates began asking why Emma was being photographed, why her case mattered so much, why guards seemed more protective around her. The unwanted attention made her a target. One evening, while returning from the library, Emma overheard two inmates discussing her appeal, saying things like, "She thinks she's getting out," And if she walks free after what she did, what does that say about us? The resentment grew. Prison is a place where justice, fairness, and morality are constantly interpreted through rough, unfiltered lenses. Many inmates were mothers. Many were victims of violence. To them, Emma's notoriety felt like a privilege she didn't deserve. Administrators scrambled to trace the leak. Investigators discovered that a newly hired correctional officer had been secretly communicating with someone online, sending them updates about Emma in exchange for money. The officer was immediately terminated and arrested, but the damage was done. Trust was gone, safety was compromised, and Emma learned a frightening new reality. The world outside wasn't the only place where the consequences of her crime could destroy her future. But the most unexpected threat wasn't from hostile inmates or leaked photos. It was from a powerful legal precedent emerging in another state, one that could either save Emma or shut her appeal down forever. While the prison leak stirred chaos behind bars, another development quietly emerged in legal circles, one with the power to reshape Emma Anderson's fate more than any psychologist, witness, or protest ever could. Hundreds of miles away, a state Supreme Court had just ruled on a separate juvenile homicide case, issuing a decision that sent shockwaves through the justice system. The ruling declared that mandatory life without parole for juveniles violated evolving standards of decency, citing new neurological research on teenage brain development. Legal analysts immediately recognized its significance. Though the case wasn't identical to Emma's, it carried striking parallels. A minor convicted of a brutal, premeditated murder, sentenced to die behind bars, and later demonstrating maturation and psychological growth. Within hours of the ruling, Emma's appellate attorney received a flurry of emails from national legal experts urging him to incorporate the decision into her appeal. The argument was simple but powerful. If another state acknowledged that teenagers, even those who commit horrific crimes, possess the capacity for change, how long could Montana ignore the same evolving standards? But the prosecution saw the danger too, and they acted fast. They filed a countermotion arguing that Emma's crime demonstrated adult-level planning and execution, claiming the ruling from another state shouldn't apply. They emphasized the brutality: 3 shots, staged evidence, financial motive, and months of calculated planning. They asserted that Emma's emotional detachment made her case fundamentally different from impulsive or reactive juvenile murders. The appeals judges, caught between shifting national standards and the specific brutality of Emma's crime, faced an impossible dilemma. Should they follow emerging trends in juvenile justice, or uphold the original sentence to honor the severity of the act and the pain of the victim's family? Emma, sitting in her cell, had no idea of the legal storm brewing outside. She didn't know her life was being debated in law schools, courtrooms, and legislative halls. She didn't know her case was becoming a reference point in national conversations about morality, punishment, and redemption. All she knew was that for the first time in years, her future was no longer set in stone. But just as the legal tide seemed to shift in her favor, a surprising discovery deep within the original case file would cast new shadows of doubt over everything, forcing the court to re-examine a detail they had overlooked for years. As attorneys, analysts, and judges dissected Emma Anderson's appeal from every possible angle, a junior legal researcher assigned to review the original case file stumbled onto something that had gone unnoticed for years. Not evidence that proved innocence, not a contradiction that shifted blame, but a procedural oversight buried in the earliest hours of the investigation. It began with a simple note scribbled by a responding officer on Christmas morning, logged in hurried handwriting. Bedroom door slightly ajar upon arrival. This line, easily overlooked during the frenzy of processing a murder scene, conflicted with Emma's original statement, one she told repeatedly, that she had stayed locked inside her room with the door shut, paralyzed in fear until minutes before calling 911. At first glance, the detail seemed minor, insignificant, a footnote in a massive case, but the more the appeals team examined it, the more troubling it became. Officers had documented no forced entry on Emma's bedroom door, no damage. No signs she had been hiding or barricading herself, and the angle of the door, paired with statements from first responders, suggested it hadn't just been opened recently, it had likely been open for hours. If the door was open, or even partially cracked, it contradicted Emma's foundational claim that she didn't see or hear anything until the gunshots. It meant she may have witnessed more than she admitted, or had been moving through the hallway long before the shots were fired. More importantly, the oversight raised a legal question. Did investigators rely on an unverified assumption early in the case that shaped Emma's narrative as a victim, delaying the moment she should have been considered a suspect? If the door had been documented more thoroughly, If the contradiction had been caught earlier, the interrogation process and the Miranda timeline might have unfolded differently. Suddenly, attorneys realized this wasn't just a physical detail. It could be grounds for questioning whether Emma's first statements were taken under the correct legal conditions. If her initial emotional state had been misinterpreted because investigators assumed she was a terrified child instead of a suspect, then her early questioning could be challenged and potentially thrown out. A ripple began to spread through the court. Had a small oversight created a procedural vulnerability, and this vulnerability would open the door to an even deeper controversy, because an internal review revealed that Emma wasn't the only one investigators misunderstood that morning. As the overlooked detail about Emma's bedroom door raised concerns, the appeals team pushed for a deeper internal review of the earliest investigative actions. What they uncovered next did not undermine the evidence against Emma, but it exposed a chain of misunderstandings that shaped the narrative in those crucial first hours. On Christmas morning, officers had arrived expecting a terrified child and a violent home invasion. That assumption, reasonable but unverified, colored everything that followed. The internal review revealed that first responders were so focused on protecting Emma that they unintentionally avoided questioning her too deeply in the immediate aftermath. They documented her tears, her trembling voice, her shock, but they did not press her with the kind of clarifying questions that might have exposed cracks in her story earlier. One officer admitted he never checked Emma's hands for warmth that might indicate recent activity. Another failed to test her pajamas for blood transfer until hours later, delaying the timeline that eventually tied her clothing to the final shot. More surprisingly, a paramedic reported that although Emma claimed she had just discovered her father's body moments before calling 911, her emotional response didn't align with someone in fresh shock, something he noted privately, but did not record officially because he believed she was traumatized. Even the forced window was initially accepted at face value, with officers focusing on securing the scene rather than analyzing whether the pry marks looked authentic. Only later did crime scene specialists determine the window was staged. These early misinterpretations weren't evidence of innocence, but they revealed how quickly a narrative can form when assumptions overshadow procedure. The appeals attorneys argued that had investigators treated Emma as a potential suspect from the beginning, rather than protecting her as a frightened child, certain statements she made might not meet the standards required for admissibility. Prosecutors pushed back fiercely, insisting that despite early missteps, the overwhelming physical and digital evidence still proved Emma's guilt beyond any doubt. But the appeals judges couldn't ignore the growing list of inconsistencies in the investigative timeline. Even if they didn't undermine the conviction, they complicated the question of whether Emma's sentence should remain untouched. Yet just as the legal debate intensified, an unexpected figure stepped forward, someone whose testimony had never been heard and whose story threatened to complicate the case even further. Just as the appeals court began wrestling with the possibility of procedural errors and investigative missteps, a surprise development shook the case. A new witness stepped forward, someone who had lived in the same neighborhood during the time of the murder, but whose voice had never been included in the original trial. Her name was Rachel Donner, a former neighbor who had moved away shortly after the crime. She had avoided involvement out of fear, not for herself, but for her family. Now, years later, with the case back in national spotlight, she felt compelled to speak. What made Rachel's testimony remarkable wasn't that she remembered the crime, it was that she remembered the days leading up to it. She claimed she had seen Emma and William Anderson arguing outside the home a week before Christmas. According to her, Emma looked angry and emotional, while William appeared stern but concerned. Rachel recalled hearing Emma yell something like, "You can't control me forever." Rachel didn't report it at the time because arguments between teenagers and parents weren't unusual. But in hindsight, knowing the shock that followed days later, the memory felt heavier, darker. She also revealed something else. On Christmas Eve, she claimed to have seen Jake Mercer's car parked further down the street around 11 p.m., partially hidden by a row of winter-bear trees. She hadn't recognized the car as significant at the time. Only after the news unfolded did she realize who it belonged to. Her testimony didn't prove or disprove guilt, but it added a new dimension to the emotional landscape leading up to the murder. It painted a picture of tension, escalating beyond the walls of the Anderson home, suggesting the family conflict was not as quiet or contained as it appeared in trial. For the defense, Rachel's account supported their narrative. A vulnerable teenager under intense emotional strain and possibly manipulation. For the prosecution, her testimony reinforced something else entirely: the growing volatility inside the Anderson household and the mounting resentment Emma may have felt toward her father. Both sides rushed to analyze the implications, but the timing of her statement raised questions, because the court now had to decide, was this long overdue truth or a memory warped by years of silence and media influence? Rachel Donner's late testimony didn't just add new information, it ignited one of the most delicate debates in the appeals process: the unreliability of long-delayed memories. Human memory is fragile, shaped by time, emotion, and repetition. And in a case as public and emotionally charged as Emma Anderson's, the court had to decide whether Rachel's recollections were genuine or unintentionally influenced. Appeals judges questioned why Rachel had stayed silent for so long. She explained that she had moved states immediately after the murder due to her husband's job transfer, and by the time she fully understood the details of the case, she felt it wasn't her place to intervene. But as years passed and documentaries revisited the crime, guilt crept in. She worried that her silence had deprived the court of context that might have changed the outcome. Psychological experts weighed in, reminding the court that memories from emotionally neutral moments, like witnessing an argument, can warp when revisited under the influence of later tragedy. Was her recollection precise? Or had years of media coverage shaped the way she remembered? Even so, her statements couldn't be dismissed outright. Too many parts matched other evidence: the escalating tension between Emma and her father, Jake's presence in the neighborhood, and the emotional instability that had taken root in Emma's life long before the shooting. The prosecution argued Rachel's memories were unreliable, clouded by time, and influenced by sensational documentaries. The defense countered that her testimony aligned with text messages and digital evidence, proving Emma was under psychological and emotional strain that the original trial failed to fully explore. Social media fueled the fire, turning Rachel into a trending topic overnight. Some praised her courage, others attacked her credibility. Meanwhile, Emma, who had never heard Rachel's name before, was shaken. Her past, once boxed tightly in her mind, was being reopened by strangers. But the court still had one more question to weigh. Even if Rachel's memory was flawed, did it matter? The crime itself hadn't changed. The facts were intact, yet the emotional context, the story of how Emma reached that breaking point, seemed to evolve with every new voice. And just when the case seemed tangled enough, the appeals court uncovered something shocking: a sealed document from the original trial that had never been shown to the defense or to the public. As the appeals court sifted through years of evidence, reports, transcripts, and motions, a clerk flagged something unusual: a sealed document buried deep in the archive of the original trial. It was marked as confidential, stamped with a judge's order, and never introduced to the defense team during Emma Anderson's proceedings. At first, the appeals judges assumed it was unrelated, but protocol required them to read it privately, and when they did, the atmosphere in chambers changed instantly. The document was a suppressed psychological assessment conducted just days after Emma's arrest, an observation report from a state-appointed forensic evaluator who had met Emma before she fully understood the charges against her. It wasn't a full evaluation, not admissible as expert testimony, but it contained early impressions that painted Emma in a startlingly different light. The evaluator wrote that Emma displayed signs of acute trauma, emotional dissociation, and shock, consistent with a minor trying to process violent events she didn't fully comprehend. The report noted that her flat affect, interpreted by prosecutors as coldness, might have been a defensive response, a psychological shutdown commonly seen in adolescents facing extreme stress. Even more controversially, the evaluator questioned whether Emma understood her Miranda rights during the first interrogation, given her emotional state. That question was never raised in trial. And the report, for reasons still unclear, was sealed and never provided to the defense. Prosecutors claimed later that it was sealed because it was an incomplete assessment and therefore not relevant. But the appeals court saw it differently. While the report didn't excuse the crime or contradict the digital evidence, it challenged the narrative of a cold-blooded, emotionless teen, and it suggested that Emma's initial confession might have been given while she was psychologically compromised. Suddenly, the appeals judges had to ask themselves a difficult question: if the defense had been given access to this document, would the sentence, if not the verdict, have been different, and more urgently? Did withholding it violate Emma's constitutional right to a fair trial? The case teetered on the edge of a legal earthquake, and the next revelation would shake the foundation even further, because the sealed report wasn't the only thing buried. There were internal emails showing why it was hidden in the first place. The sealed psychological assessment alone was shocking enough, but what came next pushed the entire Emma Anderson case into dangerous territory. When the appeals court ordered a deeper review of how such a critical document had been buried, investigators uncovered a chain of internal emails exchanged between members of the prosecution team during the original trial. These emails had never been disclosed. They weren't meant to be seen by the defense, the court, or anyone outside the prosecution's inner circle, and their contents raised disturbing questions about transparency, ethics, and whether the pursuit of a conviction had overshadowed the pursuit of justice. In the emails, one junior prosecutor expressed concern that the early psychological assessment complicated the theory that Emma was cold, calculating, and emotionless. She noted that if the defense received the report, they could argue Emma was in a dissociative state during her confession, potentially weakening the prosecution's ability to argue premeditation with absolute certainty. Another email from a senior prosecutor responded bluntly, "We don't need this clouding the case. Seal it. It's incomplete, not required for disclosure." A third message revealed the true motive. "The report makes her look sympathetic. We can't afford that in front of a jury." This wasn't just a strategic decision. It was a deliberate move to keep evidence from the defense that could have influenced sentencing or shaped the perception of Emma's mental state. Legally, the decision skirted dangerously close to a Brady violation, where prosecutors are required to disclose evidence that could be favorable to the defendant. Was the report favorable? Not enough to overturn a conviction, but enough to potentially influence whether a judge sentenced a 16-year-old girl to die behind bars. When the appeals attorneys read the emails, their strategy shifted instantly. This wasn't just a fight about adolescent psychology or national precedent. It had become a fight about whether Emma had received a fair trial at all. Prosecutors from the original trial faced scrutiny. Legal ethics committees became involved. And suddenly, the strongest argument for revisiting Emma's sentence wasn't emotional or scientific, it was constitutional. And just as the pressure reached its peak, the court made an unprecedented decision to reopen the sentencing hearing and reconsider Emma's fate from the ground up. The courtroom that once echoed with the certainty of a life without parole sentence now carried a very different tension. After weeks of reviewing internal emails, sealed evaluations, legal precedents, and testimony never heard the first time around, the appeals court did something almost unheard of in a case this high profile. They reopened Emma Anderson's sentencing hearing. Not the verdict, Emma's guilt was not in question, but the punishment. And for the first time since she walked into prison as a 16-year-old girl, Emma faced a judge with the possibility, however small, of a changed future. The room was packed again, but the atmosphere was different. Less rage, more unease, more uncertainty. Legal observers filled the back rows, whispering about ethics violations and constitutional questions. Former teachers arrived, some supporting Emma's potential rehabilitation, others opposing any shift in the sentence that had brought them closure. Catherine Walsh, William's sister, returned with a face hardened by years of grief and a resolve that hadn't wavered. She spoke first, reminding the court that William had no chance at rehabilitation, that his life had been taken with planning and precision. That opening this door felt like reopening a wound her family had barely survived. Emma's attorney responded with equal force. He presented evidence of Emma's growth, psychological maturity, remorse, and transformation over the years. He walked the court through the suppressed psychological report, the internal emails showing deliberate withholding of evidence, and national legal trends recognizing the evolving nature of juvenile sentencing. He didn't argue that Emma should walk free. He didn't pretend the crime was anything less than horrific. Instead, he argued for possibility, the chance for Emma to someday earn a life outside steel bars, after decades of reflection, growth, and rehabilitation. Then Emma stood, not as the hollow-eyed teenager from the first trial, but as a young woman shaped by years of consequence. She didn't cry, she didn't beg, she simply spoke. "I know what I did can't be undone. I know what I took from my father. I live with it every day. I'm asking for the chance to spend the rest of my life proving I'm not the girl who made that choice." The judge listened in deep silence, balancing the weight of a father's stolen life, a daughter's irreversible mistake, and a justice system confronting its own imperfections. And as the hearing closed, the world waited for the judge's ruling, unaware that the final decision would reshape not only Emma's future, but the legal landscape surrounding juvenile justice forever.